For many years, I had been wanting to make a film on Charles Correa's architecture. Every time I saw a Correa building, I was intrigued by its appearance and wanted to know more. Hence, this film, which is not just a catalogue of Correa's large body of work, but a personal investigation into the mind of a very important contemporary artist. It all started 20 years ago, while shooting a Correa building for another film that I was making at that time. I began to observe it carefully by moving through and around the building. I felt the rhythms of its spaces, noted how it responded to changing light. It was a deeply moving experience. It led me to study his other buildings and, finally, to this film.
I think I became an architect because of toy trains. As a child, I had some old tin plate rails and a couple of locomotives and wagons. Nothing more ambitious. Really just enough to run the trains around your room and the following day perhaps change the layout so that they could run into the next room, under a table and back again. That was the marvelous thing about those old tin plate trains. They had flexibility. I drew out on graph paper the most elaborate layouts, straight rails, curved ones, sidings, crossovers, the works. Trains move through tunnels, stations, over bridges in one direction, and then through cunningly placed figure eights came right back through the same stations and tunnels, but now in the other direction, setting up a brand new sequence. Anyway, that's how I spent many of my classroom hours drawing out those hypothetical layouts in my exercise book. Years later, coming for the first time across an architectural journal, I felt I could read the various plans and sections and what they were trying to do. That much I owed to toy trains.
Correa started his practice in 1958, here in Mumbai. His architecture is very much a hands-on activity, a cottage industry, as he says, like handicrafts or carpet weaving. I remember the first Correa building I ever saw, the Gandhi Smarak Sangrahalaya at the Sabarmati Ashram in Ahmedabad, a memorial to Mahatma Gandhi, a museum of his letters, photographs and books, and a center for studying Gandhiji's life and values.
We had to make a place which spoke of Gandhiji and his life and his values and his philosophy. It's amazing what he achieved. And very simply, look at his last possessions. Just some simple objects. I think 2 pairs of chappals and a lota, and then some glasses, I think spectacles. And I think there was 3 monkeys, which always like see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil. So It's actually, here's a man who's, I think, a wonderful man. I'm glad he's back in fashion. But really, I don't think he had an aesthetic sense, a visual sense, any more than Mao Zedong, who also changed his country. But this picture is probably the most aesthetic picture I know of from that period. This is almost like Zen philosophy. Now, how do we express that in a building? That is what architecture is about.
There was an elegance, an austere beauty about this architecture, and a masterful use of light and shade.
The soil there is very bad. It's reclaimed soil on the edge of the river, the Sabarmati River. And so we had to put in these columns which were on a foundation. And in between we had to span with a beam, plinth beam it's called. And so the idea came up, instead of keeping that plinth beam at ground level where it's really usually kept, I thought if we kept it slightly above the ground, then it seems to make the building float, which it is. You suddenly see that in the Katsura Palace in Japan, that the slightly floating effect gives a sense that it's hovering there, and that lightens everything, yes.
The remarkable thing about this building is its very human scale. Each unit is only 6 meters by 6 meters, on a grid of columns just over 2 meters high. On these are placed U-shaped beams, which also act as channels to drain out the rainwater. Over this are the pyramidal roofs of wood and clay tiles. Since the books, letters and other exhibits would grow over the years, Correa made its structure modular for easy expansion. The structure is a matrix of covered and open spaces, which creates a feeling of lightness and transparency.
I think I got this idea from one of my professors at MIT, Yuri Kepish. He used to say that museums are very tiring experiences and only tourists have the energy to go through them, like in the Louvre, where you have to go from room to room to room looking at things. And he said, museums must have spaces where the eye can rest. Maybe it's a little courtyard or a garden. I've always remembered that, and the museums I've designed, they've never been one continuously enclosed space.
An essential element in Correa's architecture is the pathway. We will meet this pathway in Correa's work in many different ways throughout this film. In this particular building, it gives you the feeling of walking through an Indian village, like the villages that Gandhiji always loved. When he inaugurated the building in 1963, Prime Minister Nehru said, "You have built here a beautiful museum. Whatever I have seen has been done with understanding of a sort that suits this holy place. There is nothing pretentious here. It is a simple and lovely building." And Kenneth Frampton, the noted architectural critic, has written, "The Gandhi Museum remains one of the most compelling national monuments erected anywhere in this century." Correa has received national as well as international recognition and the very highest awards of his profession. In 1984, he was presented with the gold medal of the Royal Institute of British Architects by Prince Charles at Hampton Court Palace. In 1991, the gold medal of the International Union of Architects. In 1993, the Praemium Imperiale from Prince Hitachi of Japan.
The Praemium Imperiale.
International advisor David Rockefeller Jr. remarked that it required more than 20 years for the Nobel Prize to receive worldwide recognition, but in just 6 years, many people had already come to understand the importance and prestige of the Praemium Imperiale.
Before the Nobels gained world attention.
All the winners are artists of unique accomplishment.
The President then introduced each of the recipients and his works. Each was greeted with warmth and congratulations.
In 1998, the Aga Khan Award for Architecture from King Carlos of Spain, and in 2006 came the Padma Vibhushan from the President of India.
Padma Vibhushan, Shri Charles Correa,
Correa was born in Secunderabad in September 1930. The family moved to Mumbai to stay with his grandparents because of the early death of Charles's father. They lived in Ballad Estate near the docks, and the children were often taken to see the ships.
We would go there as children and you could see the sea. And the ships would come at Ballad Pier, and now and again we could get to see them. We were taken on a Saturday morning, let's say. It was beautiful to go and see those ships. I just liked them very much, especially the ones in dry dock. There's something really incredible about, and we weren't allowed down, but you'd see the divers would go down first and place the blocks, and the ship comes in, then they pump out the water, and there's this incredible thing. You know, this hull is designed to keep out the most violent seas. As someone once said, real beauty has terror in it. It was very easy for me to understand what drove people like Corbusier and Gropius and the whole aesthetic of the modern movement, because their ideas were based on the beauty of ships, steam locomotives, big bridges, grain silos, all the things which engineering had produced in the 19th century, and which we actually see around us.
In 1948, when Charles was 18 years old, he left for the United States to study architecture. He got his bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan in 1953, and in 1955, his master's degree from MIT, where he was lucky to have great teachers whose ideas influenced him.
I had teachers like Bucky Fuller, who was a wonderful man. He was an architect in a very special sense. He was really also an inventor. You know, he's the one who did these geodesic domes. And his output was incredibly varied. It was automobiles and houses and metaphysics and structural geometry. But what was constant through it all was his vision and his principles. And there was Kepish, a painter who had come across from the Bauhaus. Kepish ran a seminar which taught me how to think and how to articulate ideas. He didn't teach architecture. He spoke about painting, about music, about literature, about other things. Of course, what I had learned in America are the principles that make architecture. The principles that you look for local materials, you deal with the climate, you try to deal with the culture, the aspirations of the people there. That's what architecture is about.
Correa's thesis at MIT was truly original. It wasn't the design of a building. Instead, he made a film, an animation film. Films and filmmaking have always fascinated Charles. In fact, he sees clear creative links between architecture and filmmaking. Architecture is also a succession of images, he says. The main difference is time. After finishing his master's degree, Correa returned to India in 1955.
We made a tryst with destiny.
It was a newly independent India, going through an exciting period in all fields, including, of course, architecture.
And of course there was Corbusier building in Chandigarh, so India was a very rich place to come back to. When I got back, I went to places like Delhi or Calcutta, and it was wonderful to go up there and see the Mughal architecture, see the wonderful architecture produced. You know, if you look at what the Mughals built up in Delhi and that area, it's really brilliant. They made these courtyards, and in the early morning they would stretch a shamiana across them so they could trap the cold night air. In the evening, when the temperature had cooled down, they would come out on the terraces. And then if you look at the indigenous architecture in the villages and in the towns, it's really wonderfully inventive, both in form as well as in color. In Sindh, for instance, or in Iran, they have wind catcher houses. These are houses which have a scoop to catch the desert wind, and it goes down into the basement where it passes over a pool of water and becomes humidified, and then it comes up to the rooms. I think Corbusier called a house a machine for living, but these things are, I don't think he ever produced something as dramatic as this. So that influenced me a lot, and some of my early work was all about really dealing with the climate. That means by triggering off something in your imagination about form.
In 1961, the Tube House won first prize in an all-India competition for low-cost housing. Here, a current of natural ventilation is generated by the very shape of the unit. Hot air rises and escapes from the top, drawing in fresh new air to replace it. The Parekh house consists of two different sections. The summer section, to be used in the hot afternoons. Next to it, the winter section, where the terraces open up to the sky. His Ramakrishna house, designed for one of the wealthiest mill owners of Ahmedabad, uses the same principle as the Tube House. The plan sets up a series of parallel brick walls, punctuated by interior courts, climaxing in the living room which opens onto the main garden. A seminal project in the development of these ideas was the Hindustan Lever Pavilion, an experimental design built for the 1961 Industrial Fair in Delhi. Once again we find the pathway taking us through the building. The random structure had no right angles. Its fractured surfaces produced startling spaces, scaleless and disorienting. Today such architecture is considered very avant-garde, but the Hindustan Lever Pavilion was built more than 40 years ago. Though Charles has always worked from Mumbai, this city has only a few of his buildings. One of them is Kanchanjunga. I vividly remember how this building sort of jumped at you every time you came over the rising curve of Pedder Road, with its stark minimalism and brilliant colors. Although Kanchanjunga was built more than 30 years ago, it still stands out as a unique edifice in the city. When I learned that the traditional bungalow was the inspiration for this high-rise building, I was really intrigued.
The principle of the traditional bungalow is extremely simple and effective. The main living spaces are surrounded by a ring of verandas which provide an extra layer of protection against the sun and the rain. The idea is to make this veranda into a double-height terrace garden where we can use the rain and the sun to help the plants to grow. Such a unit can then interlock with the one below. Here are the two units drawn to scale and repeated with variations to create a tower 29 stories high of luxury apartments, varying from 2 to 6 bedrooms.
Rising to a height of 80 meters, Kanchanjunga is an elegant piece of sculpture. From the upper bedrooms, the double-height terrace gives one a diagonal view across Bombay, with the overhanging cantilevered slab above acting like a great protective eyebrow. Kanchanjunga stands like a tree of life, the rest of Bombay all around. But there are other Bombays as well. Today, more than 10 million people live in slums. This is Dharavi, one of the largest slums in the whole of Asia, with more than 600,000 inhabitants.
One is struck by the astonishing ability of people to try to humanize the wretched conditions in which they are condemned to live. somehow, even in these crevices, life continues. But beyond this, Dharavi is a vivid illustration of the grotesque mismatch in our cities between demand and supply, a mismatch where only the rich can survive. In Bombay today, 10 million people are living in this kind of degrading squalor.
In 1940, the population of Bombay was just 2 million. By 1964, it had grown to 4.5 million, and the first squatters had started to appear. By 1984, the population was 8 million, of which 4 million were squatters. Today, it is over 16 million, of which almost 10 million are squatters. Back in 1964, when illegal settlements had just started to appear, Correa and his two colleagues, Shirish Patel and Praveena Mehta, argued passionately for opening up the mainland across the harbour, before the city was engulfed by a sea of squatter colonies. In order to convince the government and to encourage public discussion of these vital issues, Correa made this film called The City on the Water, explaining to citizens what was happening to their city and to their lives.
Incredible, isn't it? 500,000 people arriving every morning. Nobody leaving.
Morning arrives, and with it starts the collection of water for the day's needs, the elementary essentials of life.
From further and further north, the people come. About 2 or 3 persons a day are killed, falling off these trains. People need transport to find jobs, so they live illegally around the station. Do we really have to treat people this way?
The facts of the matter are brutally simple. You've got to be rich to afford Bombay. The city is really one long breakwater, protecting the harbour from the open sea. Opening up the harbour will bring the waterfront back to Bombay. Plazas, like the gateway, along the eastern shore of the island will change the north-south structure into an east-west one. And looking eastward, the energy of New Bombay will stimulate development in the mainland, opening up new growth across the state. Water will once again become the focal point of the whole system, providing communication between the various centers. And in the middle of it all, the island of Elephanta, an umbilical cord that takes one back 1,000 years. Bombay from now on will become a multi-centered city around the harbour, each new centre opening up more space for the people of this city.
In 1970, the government accepted the idea and created CIDCO to design and develop the new city. Today, Navi Mumbai's population is nearing 2 million, but unfortunately the crucial benefits of using public transport and of orienting this new growth towards the waterfront has not been followed, nor perhaps even understood. Another area in which Correa has done pioneering work is affordable housing. Here is a project in Belapur in Navi Mumbai that, instead of building apartment blocks, gives each family its own site to build an independent house.
Row housing, which is the conventional way to achieve higher densities, severely restricts light and air for the houses. But the same densities can be achieved with freestanding houses. Here are 7 of them arranged around a small courtyard. By repeating this pattern again and then again, we get 24 houses, which through the same process reaches 82, in a pattern which generates community spaces integrated with the housing.
This affordable housing project accommodates 600 families in an area of just 6 hectares. This includes schools and other community spaces integrated seamlessly with the houses themselves. Another set of urban issues in which Correa was deeply involved concerned the mill lands in Bombay. The heart of the city was its textile mills. The mills closed down, one by one, over the last 2 decades after a protracted strike. This led to thousands losing their jobs. The recycling of the vast tracts of land in the center of the city has been one of the major issues facing Mumbai. This public exhibition, sponsored by the Urban Development Research Institute and organized by Correa, addressed the problem of recycling these mill lands. It advocated that a portion of the land should be used to provide schools, parks, and other social amenities for the city. It also emphasized the need for east-west public transport to connect the western shore of the city to the eastern waterfront, and thence across to Navi Mumbai and the rest of Maharashtra. Correa's family comes from Goa. He has many relations and friends here. Goa is a second home to him. He has designed his own house in Goa along the banks of the historic Mandovi River. You feel you're floating here, suspended above the river.
You know, it's wonderful living here on the edge of this historic river. The Mandovi is really the history of Goa. Just about every invader came in down this river through that pass and to Old Goa. That is Adil Khan, then Albuquerque, the whole lot of them, and the battles that were fought along this river all the way down there. It gives you a great sense of the primordial, and yet it's so calm right now.
When we were in Goa for the shoot of this film, Correa took us around to see some of Goa's indigenous architecture that had developed organically with time. Correa's own projects in Goa reflect this context, but they also address an issue which is of crucial importance to him, and that is the relationship of architecture to the other visual arts, painting, sculpture, and landscape. One of these projects is the Hotel Siddharth de Goa.
In this hotel in Goa, Siddharth de Goa, we knew that it had to have a certain level of nostalgia because it was a tourist hotel. But I felt we could do this by having a layer of virtual imagery which would come from painting. And so the building is built, and in the process of building it, you realize there are moments which the architecture has to be corrected. For instance, let's take the room we're in, this one. All the light is coming from this window. There's not much happening behind me. But if we had an artist to paint a street scene here, a street coming on, another one there, and they meet at the corner, the tension from that corner would balance all the light coming in from the window. That is how actually you see, when you go to Florence and you see the murals, they are correcting the architecture and vice versa.
The Kala Academy is a cultural center for the arts, painting, music, cinema, theatre and so on. Situated on the banks of the Mandovi River, the building is really one large veranda, with the sea breezes blowing right through. And here again, there is that interplay between architecture and virtual imagery. In the interior of the main auditorium, the virtual balconies are a collaboration between Correa and Mario Miranda, the celebrated Goan cartoonist. In the British Council building in Delhi, the gigantic mural by Howard Hodgkin is like the shadow of a banyan tree. A shadow in which a number of different mindsets continue to live together in India.
Whether these forms are the limbs of a tree or a catalpa or a banyan or whatever, you have a sense of an organic form. That's the key thing. And of course this tension that exists between this organic form contained within a rather severe building, austere building in a certain sense, except it has this wonderful pink sandstone. It's a wonderful balance. And you have this sense of these forms sort of pushing their way out.
Down the center of the site are three axis mundi. That is the mythic axis that connects earth to sky. At the far end of the site is the axis mundi of Hinduism, the Bindu, the source of all energy. In the center is the Charbagh, the mythic Persian image of the Garden of Paradise that Islam brought to India. And at the entrance we have the European axis mundi from the Renaissance, a symbol used by Michelangelo in the Capitol in Rome. So the building is really many layers, a palimpsest, like India herself.
We have our own agendas. You're asked to do something, and of course you solve the practical problem, hopefully, but you also should, and you do have other intentions. So in this particular building, the client just wanted a library and some offices, but they were very supportive, and I said, look, why don't we try and express something more ambitious? And then, of course, Howard Hodgkin came in with this mural of India as a large tree which can protect all that, which shades all that, which lets all that pluralism happens because it is India.
This is the original artwork that Howard Hodgkins made for the British Council mural. We are in the Correa home here in Bombay, where the family has lived for more than 4 decades. The tapestries on these walls are the work of his wife Monica Correa, who is a textile weaver. In these pieces, she uses only hand-spun wool and unbleached cotton. Monica and Charles were married in 1961. They have 2 children, Nandita and Nakul. Through the years, the children have grown up. And now they have 5 grandchildren. Monica's works hang in museums and galleries and in private collections, including the Four Seasons in New York, where Philip Johnson commissioned 4 tapestries. Monica's weaving has had considerable influence on Charles's own work, and they have often worked together, as on the interiors for the Hotel Siddharth in Goa and the Bay Island Resort in the Andamans.
Well, India has a wealth of textiles. I mean, we all use textiles in our everyday lives. Textiles even played a wonderful role in the freedom struggle. That's why you have a charka actually on the national flag. As a young girl, I would look at these beautiful temple saris that came out of Kanchipuram. I was fascinated by the motifs that they had worked into these saris. One found that these patterns existed in India in all these spheres of weaving, of jewelry, into sculpture and architecture. Well, here's an example of it. This is a sari from Orissa, and you have the mandala, and here are the 9 squares, and the fish, and the rudraksh. These motifs were based on religious motifs or sacred motifs, or the symbols of fertility, which were used and incorporated in these textiles.
A prime example of these connections was Vistar, the exhibition on Indian architecture that Charles and his colleagues organized for the Festival of India. It was an eye-opener for many of my generation. It made us take a fresh look at a number of familiar practices we just took for granted.
We started with the way people live. You know, it's not, and the patterns go very, very deep. It comes out of the way they live, the fabrics they wear, the rangoli patterns on the floor. These are all memories of something sacred. And it's incredible. It runs all the way through life. So the mandala is not just present in the museums like it is in some other society. In India, it comes right into what some people, street people are doing by making these things, these patterns. So in this exhibition, we first of all positioned architecture in its relationship to all these other things, including dance and sculpture. We made a list of all the buildings we would include. And I thought the old buildings would be beautiful, but the buildings, the contemporary ones, I mean, of that century, the 20th century, would be the ones with ideas of, you know, Corbusier and all that. And I was wrong. The old buildings were not only spectacularly beautiful, they had the ideas. They were based on really the most profound ideas about the cosmos. In fact, architecture was seen as a model of the cosmos. This is Modera, with a beautiful kund in front of the temple. If the temple is a model of the cosmos, then this kund is an inverse model of the cosmos, inlaid into the earth. It's really so beautiful, for as the water recedes, the same rituals can be performed at different levels.
This is Jaipur, the city planned by Jai Singh, its 18th century ruler, to represent Navagraha, the mandala of the 9 planets. Because of a hill, one of the squares got moved to the other side.
And the wonderful thing about Jaipur is that Jai Singh, who was the ruler who built it, had these 2 takes on the sky. One was the oldest myths of the 9 planets, Navagraha. The other was the newest myths of science, which had just started in trying to measure the sun and the moon, but through instruments which were not movable, because that spoils the whole accuracy. These are huge values which science brought, and he combined them both in the city. And I thought that's wonderful, because he was really looking backward and forward in one gesture. Jai Singh was a truly extraordinary man. In a certain sense, perhaps he was the first modern Indian and a precursor of Nehru, who also, when we became an independent nation in 1947, tried to rediscover India's past while simultaneously opening a door to a brand new future.
So when Correa was asked to design this art center in Jaipur in memory of Jawaharlal Nehru, he designed a contemporary building that was based on the same Navagraha, connecting past and present in one integrated gesture in honor of Nehru and of Jai Singh. The brief prepared by the state government listed a number of items, like art galleries, exhibition halls, craft workshops, theatres, and so forth. Correa took these requirements and ingeniously assigned each one of them to the appropriate planet. One of the squares is moved, recalling the gesture of Jai Singh that created the plan of Jaipur. And we find again the pathway that moves through it all, sometimes open to sky and sometimes under cover.
So here you have the 9 planets, and one of them is moved to the right, and that gives the public access to Mangal, which is for the administration, Guru, the library, and Shukra, where the theatres are. That movement gave me access to the mandala. So we enter here. This is where the administration is, Mangal, the planet of power. On this dome, Rajasthan's traditional artists have depicted a giant cosmograph representing the entire manifest world. Every tree, every fish, every animal, every mountain. Similarly, each one of the other 9 planets has its own unique plan and form, illustrating the traditional qualities of that planet, including its auspicious colors.
In the center is the 9th square, an open-to-sky amphitheater. This is crucial, for when you move around through the other squares, you sense your orientation through the glimpses you get of this empty center. On the red sandstone walls of each planet is inlaid its traditional symbol in white marble and black Kadapa stone. While Correa was designing the Jawahar Kala Kendra in Jaipur, he wondered, could one design a modern building based on today's notions of the cosmos, the black holes of outer space, the Big Bang theory, the ever-expanding universe? The opportunity came when the renowned mathematician Jayant Narlikar and his team of scientists asked him to design the Inter-University Center for Astrophysics at Pune University.
Today's ideas of what actually is the reality of the non-manifest world, let's say, around us, is much more mind-blowing than anything out of the poor mandala. It's very down-to-earth compared to what scientists believe, and which all of us accept. But we don't make part of our lives. One thing about the ancients, they made the mandala part of their lives, their jewelry, their everything. Professor Narlikar, the mathematician, he asked me if I would design a center for him at Pune University for astronomy and astrophysics. And I said, on condition we try to do this, express the ideas you believe in. And it was wonderful, because you need a very supportive client to do something like that. And he and the other scientists there, in fact, most of the ideas of, I don't know what the universe is about, they did. And most of the ideas came from them. So here landscape is used not just to look pretty, but to represent certain truths from contemporary science. For instance, this courtyard had 2 trees. Instead of removing one of them, it was decided to keep them both to represent the Roche lobes, which are the energy fields generated by 2 adjacent planets in outer space. Another example is Sierpinski's gasket, a fractal pattern that stays identical regardless of any magnification or reduction.
In today's context, these 2 projects at Jaipur and Pune are very unusual in that they are both models of the cosmos. Each project, in its own way, seeks to invoke the metaphysical dimensions that lie in architecture, just below the surface.
I think the courtyard is the 3rd manifestation, to my mind, of this paradigm. So the first was the mandala with the empty center, then finding an echo today in the black holes of outer space, and then really existing in all cultures throughout human history in the courtyard house. Wherever you go, there's always a house around a courtyard or a building, and it always works. It doesn't matter if it's made of mud or made of stainless steel. There's something about the centrality and the emptiness of that center which keeps you looking at it. And it's unfortunate that in the modern movement it hasn't been used very much, mainly because the modern movement came out of it came out of Northern Europe, Anglo-Saxon, that kind of world which likes the freestanding house, which is what you see in suburbia. Our own traditions of the Haveli, etc., are really of the empty center, the house around, looking at it, and the street outside.
Correa has used courtyards in many different ways. Here, in a high-tech center. In the MRF headquarters, the atrium, which is another version of the courtyard, expresses the powerful centrality of its prototype, connecting the various office levels easily and naturally. The Brain and Cognitive Center at MIT Boston is a cutting-edge scientific institution and the largest center for brain research in the world. The site was an exceptionally difficult one. It is really 2 separate sites on either side of an existing railroad track. It houses 3 separately funded institutes, but Correa took this easily in his stride and created a piece of sculpture that rides serenely above all these problems. And here again, the atrium is the focal point, binding it all together, providing a place of interaction and discussion for the scientists who work there. And here again, we find a mastery of light and of architectonic form. Vidhan Bhavan, the Legislative Assembly of the Government of Madhya Pradesh in Bhopal, is a prime example of Correa's use of courtyards and atria to bring light and air into the heart of a large building. The building, located on top of a hill in the middle of the city, is seen from miles around in all directions.
The thing about this building is that it's on top of a hill, and you've got a road twisting and coming towards it. It's not a straight road. So the building turns as you approach it, and I found a rectangular building would change proportion. But the circular building always looks the same. And so we decided on a circle, and we had to fit all the various things into it. So these were arranged around these courtyards. So you've got 9 compartments, The center one and 4 of them are open. These are open to sky. This one in the corners is you have the combined hall, the lower house, the upper house, Vidhan Parishad, and then the library.
This is the entry courtyard for the public, with murals painted by an extraordinary painter from Bastar, the largest tribal region in India. There is also other site-specific art created by India's leading painters and sculptors. In Bhopal, a little further down the road from the Vidhan Bhavan, is Bharat Bhavan, also using courtyards but in a completely different architectural concept. It is what Correa calls a non-building. In fact, when I entered the gate of Bharat Bhavan, I couldn't see any building at all.
Yes, it's built into the hill. It's what I call a non-building, which I think is another way of seeing architecture. We made it like a public garden. In fact, people come there to use the terraces as a garden, and then they can go down to these series of courtyards where the different facilities are located. And it works because it is so casual that people, and average people, go to see it. They come on their scooters, a whole family, and then they really come for both, to walk in the garden, and then some of them get tempted. Most of them do, because the concerts are free very often, or the theatre, or they go in to see one of the art collections.
The descending courtyards culminate in an amphitheatre on the edge of the lake. Maybe I should say they dissolve into a view of the lake. For Correa, the non-building is an essential step towards finding an architecture that is rooted in India.
Louis Kahn used to say, "I love English history. I have an 8-volume edition that I read all the time." And then he'd add, "Well, actually, I've only read the first volume." And even that, after the first few pages, I stop. Because I don't believe that history started the way they say it started. I think it started before that. I want to read volume 0. Modern architecture. It started really with the Greeks. If you look at the Parthenon, it's on a hill, and it doesn't imitate nature. That is the way the European, the Mediterranean people felt, that man does not imitate nature, but he doesn't destroy nature. There's a dialogue between the Parthenon on the hill and then the nature around. And what is interesting is that paradigm came down through the Romans. It came to Palladio and to all the classical architecture. It came all the way to Corbusier. Corbusier never imitated nature. His buildings are very much a man-made object. Now, all of the architecture we build comes down that line, and then what? We turn left to reach India or turn right to reach Japan? We cannot. That's our problem. What is interesting to my mind is that if you look at Hinduism or Buddhism as being two of important factors in India, neither of them would build something in that simple dichotomy, man and nature. If I look at the caves in Ajanta, are they leaving the hill alone or are they destroying it? Neither. They have done there is an intervention, but it's a very ambiguous one. So if I start then with that idea that I don't dominate the hill, neither do I leave it alone, I come down a different pathway. And that pathway would bring me to, I think, what would be closer to a non-building. I feel that's really, really important. You have to start with a different paradigm.
Correa's newest project is in Lisbon. It is the Champalimaud Research Centre, a cutting-edge scientific facility located on an extraordinary site situated at the point where the river meets the Atlantic Ocean and from where Vasco da Gama set sail for India and the unknown. The project brings together a number of the themes that have obsessed Korea: the ritualistic pathway, the metaphysics of open-to-sky spaces, the concept of the non-building.
It's a beautiful site they've been given. It's where the, where Vasco da Gama and Henry the Navigator and all those went out from there with the maps they had. I think they got the maps from the Moors because they had no idea where they were going. They went right out into the sea, which was like outer space. It's like saying that here's a map to get to Mars, hopefully, and you get into the spaceship and you go out without having any guidance, no computers, nothing. This walk, which goes between these walls and takes you up to the end, right across the site. And you're always moving, not looking at the sea, but on a slight ramp, so that you're only seeing the sky ahead of you. I mean, the emptiness, the ambiguity of the sky. And when you reach the end, you will see water on the site, and beyond that, the ocean. This project belongs on the site. You could build the same thing in Bombay or in New York, but it wouldn't have the same wallop as it does here for the Portuguese. It reminds them of what was probably the defining moment of their history 500 years ago. In fact, one of the objectives of this research center is to bring back that sense of excellence, of daring, which was there in their nation, and which is there latent right now.
Many years ago, Correa wrote, "Strange indeed that man, since the beginning of time, has always used the most inert materials like stone and brick to express the invisibilia that move him."
That's it. Okay. Okay. I've paid. Moving.
Where the fuck are they going?
Charles Correa was born in Secunderabad in September 1930. Due to the early demise of his father, his family moved to Mumbai when Correa was very young. They lived in Balad estate, and the children were often taken to see the ships, which fascinated Correa to a great extent. Correa obtained his bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan in 1953 and his master's degree from MIT in 1958. There he was introduced to Buckminster Fuller, whom he regarded an inventor and his mentor all his life.
I think I became an architect because of toy trains. As a child, I had some old tin plate rails and a couple of locomotives and wagons. Nothing more ambitious. Really just enough to run the trains around your room and the following day perhaps change the layout so that they could run into the next room, under a table and back again. That was the marvelous thing about those old tin plate trains. They had flexibility. I drew out on graph paper the most elaborate layouts, straight rails, curved ones, sidings, crossovers, the works. Anyway, that's how I spent many of my classroom hours drawing out those hypothetical layouts in my exercise book.
Mahatma Gandhi lived on the ashram on the bank of the river Sabarmati between 1917 and 1930. It is from here that he commenced his historic march to Dandi. Correa was asked to design a memorial museum and study center in 1958 to house a treasure of some 30,000 letters written by and to Gandhi. The museum units are grouped in a consciously asymmetric manner to be analogous to the Indian village with its pathways and seemingly randomly placed buildings and its meeting points. Another way of looking at the subjective approach to his planning would be the traditional rangoli, which is again a grid-based design evident in rural courtyards. The initial construction consisted of 51 modular units of 6 by 6 meters. Load-bearing brick columns, 2 meters in height, support concrete channels, which both support the wooden roof and channelize rainwater. The museum uses a simple but delicately detailed post and beam structure. Also, Correa designed both open and closed connecting spaces, allowing for eventual expansion. The modular simplicity of the structure is continued in the use of basic materials. The modulation of ventilation was taken care of by louvered windows which were devoid of glass, thereby maintaining the basic nature of materials. The foundation is concrete and is raised about a foot from the ground, lending a floating feel to the units. Jawahar Kala Kendra is a multi-art center located in Jaipur in India. It was built by the Rajasthan government with the purpose of preserving Rajasthani arts and crafts. The center is dedicated to the memory of India's great leader Jawaharlal Nehru. The center is an analogue of the original city plan drawn up by the Maharaja Jai Singh II based on the Vedic 9-square mandala. Due to the presence of a hill, one of the squares in the grid were transposed to the east. Working on the same lines, Correa's design directly invokes the Navagraha mandala. One of the squares is pivoted to recall the original city plan and also to create an entrance. The center has been made in a grid of 9 blocks housing various functions. The disaggregated function of each square is such that it corresponds to the myths associated to the particular planet. For example, the library is located in the Mercury Square, also known as the Guru Mandala, which traditionally represents knowledge.
One of the squares is moved, recalling the gesture.
The place has an amazing interplay of light, shadow, and colors. The unit containing the library is open to sky. This was dealt with by Correa by employing one of his favorite architectural elements, pergolas, to provide respite from the sun while walking through the corridors. Frescoes on the ceilings and walls enhance the experiential quality of the center. The ceiling fresco depicts rivers, mountains, animals, and vegetation in a traditional Indian cosmology, thereby melding traditional and contemporary. Wall paintings of the Lord Krishna of the Hindu pantheon, motifs, murals, and symbols reminiscent of the ruling civilizations of the past feature in the corridor walls and on courtyard facades. As was the case with all his other structures, Correa made use of local building materials like red sandstone. Features such as dry landscaping, minimalistically painted walls, and simple flooring tiles dictate his style of ornament. Symbols of the dominant planets in each unit, made of white marble and black Kadapa stone, are inscribed on the walls of this center. Vidhan Bhavan is the new state assembly for the Madhya Pradesh government in Bhopal. It is a complete set of integrated facilities that sit on the crest of Arera Hill, which has a panoramic view towards the lake in Bhopal. Many factors determine its form, its site on the crest of a hill, and the famous Sachi Stupa being the most dominant of them all. The plan consists of a series of spaces within spaces divided into a pattern of 9 compartments. The specialized functions such as the Vidhan Sabha, Combined Hall, Vidhan Parishad, and the library occupy the extreme 4 units. Along 2 perpendicular axes within the structure are the courtyards, access corridors, and administrative offices, constituting a plus shape in plan. The form, however, is circular as Correa designed the structure to mold itself according to the access road that surrounds it, such that it would appear the same from any end. Within the structure too, Correa chose to break the grid in order to accommodate the functions which demanded larger area. This particular animation demonstrates the way Correa created open-to-sky courtyards by scooping out of an apparently bulky cylindrical mass. Correa has added to the magnificence of the structure by applying a white finish on the exterior walls. Enormous marble columns and double-height atriums elevate the grandiosity of the interiors. Repetitive motifs line the tiled flooring.
Like me too? I don't understand what you're saying. Let me talk to you. I got my eyes on you. Baby, let me tell you that you are the truth. I love your Indian food. Oh, da-da-do, da-da-do, da-do. Sing it to me. Sing it to me. Sing it to me. But I can't understand a word you're saying.
The sensibility of selecting age-old local building materials is Correa's way of making his design climate responsive. In the tube house, natural ventilation is generated by the very shape of the house. Hot air escapes from the top and fresh air is drawn in to replace it. The Parekh house in Ahmedabad is divided in two sections. The summer section to be used in the afternoon, and adjoining it, the winter section to be used in cool evenings with terraces open to sky. Also, the Ramakrishna house follows the same principle as the tube house, punctured by internal courtyards.
Thanks for the props, but to me, you the star. Let's get it on tonight while I wait.
On closely studying Charles Correa's structures, one can infer that he followed a disciplined chain of processes before finally striking upon a point which qualified to be called the concept. He also worked on the art, tradition, and history of the site he designed for, and his structures, unique as they were, invariably emphasized on the common chord. Grid-wise planning was his cheeky favorite, but Correa was never the one to have succumbed to the stigma that surrounds the rigidity of the grid. He would visualize the plan and elevation simultaneously, and thus, as he worked out a grid-based plan, he also added domes, ramps, and voids in his structure. Korean structures and sciography are inseparable as fish and water. Charles Correa's love for light and shadow play never goes amiss, as pergolas and rectangular projections arrogantly dominate his ornamentation preferences. A space that changes its visual appeal at different times of the day is fascinating to many. Pergolas also complement Correa's style of incorporating open-to-sky courtyards with the least possible hassles. While Correa never went wild with colors, he did render the required space quality with the help of wall paintings, murals, and frescoes. Skilled artisans expressed their art styles on prominent facades in many of his structures, which lent a beautiful aura to the space. By adding perspective paintings, he creates illusions of larger spaces. Paintings of animals, plants, civilizations of the past, and traditional practices find their way on the walls of his culturally oriented structures. Correa eliminated monotony in his disciplined structures by introducing and scooping out rectangular masses and irregular voids. This lends a visual dynamic nature and displays his genius in making rectangles exciting.
I'm here in the RIBA with the famous Indian architect Charles Correa with his lifetime work. And he has just gifted this to the RIBA. It is wonderful to have you here, Charles, and you are so welcome.
Yeah.
You have gifted us with 6,000 items, whether it be drawings or models or items from your wonderful lifetime's work. Tell me, it's just so important to have a full archive of your work and to digitize it, and I know that digitizing it is so important to you.
Yes.
Why is that for you?
Well, because I didn't want the drawings, frankly, to leave India, because I think that's where the work is, and that's where students would be interested. But unfortunately, we don't have the facilities in India. And then, so we tried, but they don't exist, and if they exist, they're in very bad condition, some government thing somewhere. So then, if they are to go outside India, the best place was the RIBA, I knew that. And London was the best city for discussions. But I knew we had to have a record, so we started digitizing the drawings, and that led to digitizing the photographs, and then then the whole thing evolved,
Well, it's not often that we actually get a gift to the RIBA that is so magnificent, intact, and already digitized for us. So thank you very much for that. And it'll be great for future generations to actually study the work. And the fact that it's digitized means it can be seen anywhere around the world.
That's right.
Now, when you started in practice in 1958 in India, what was it like setting up? What was it like then?
Back then, you know, India was a fresh country, and there was this wonderful feeling that everything was going to change and that we'd have a new kind of life, and that's why they did Chandigarh. The idea was, in fact, I think Corbusier was told by Nehru, by the Prime Minister, don't look at the past. I want you to build a city of the future. That sounds incredibly naive today, but I think it's wonderful. Because when a country is brand new, like South Africa was in the last decade, there's that wonderful moment where there's so much hope and everything is so fragile. You know, and you have to, at that moment, risk all, I think.
You've got a great selection of cultural buildings, and I want to talk about the JKK Centre in particular, and where the inspiration of the grid of 9 came from.
Well, that comes from the city itself. The city is based on the 9 squares mandala, which was the mandala of the 9 planets. And the ruler who built the city was obsessed with the sky. So on one side, he used the oldest myths of the sky, which is the Navgraha, the 9 planets. And then he also is the one who built the newest myths, which is science. Science today, that means those astronomical instruments, you know, the triangular ones and stuff, which were way ahead of their time. You measured very precisely the movement of the sun and the stars, because the instruments were made of masonry and fixed. So otherwise metal instruments could move with the tremor of the earth or something. So he had these 2 different takes on the sky, and he brought them together in the city. And since this is a memorial to the Nehru, our first Prime Minister, I thought nothing better than to bring back the city and this thing of looking, you know, Nehru wrote a book called The Discovery of India, which was looking backwards into what India was about. It's a wonderful book. But he also commissioned Corbusier to invent a new future. Now, how do you bring those 2 visions together?
Yeah.
So that from that frisson, which I said, we must use that, yeah.
When you're working on all of your projects, they have a wonderful human scale to them. It's not like iconic, look at me architecture, yet it is iconic in the way that you have done it. Tell me a little bit about those recurring themes, like the ritualistic pathway through your buildings, or the empty centre. Where they come from?
Well, the empty centre comes really from the courtyard house, from anything you want. But to get back to what you just said, the reason the buildings might look more human is that I feel architecture is sculpture, but it is sculpture used by human beings. So it needs doors and windows, it needs place for light and air. And those openings don't spoil the sculpture, they make it complete. Now, they also give scale to that abstraction. If you just make an abstraction, it's not architecture, to my mind. It has to be a way of, so just by expressing how people use, those gestures are very, very important. And that automatically gives a kind of different look to architecture as opposed to sculpture.
And talking of scale, actually, you've worked on some small projects,
Yes.
but also some very large urban planning
Yes,
projects.
yes.
And tell us about your thoughts on the city like Mumbai, now and in the future, how you see it going.
Well, I don't know where Bombay is going because it's getting huge, bigger and bigger. But I think our cities are wonderful because they are, I mean, I don't mean they're wonderful right now, but they have a wonderful potential for changing India in the right way. I mean, they're places where the skills we need, you know, to develop the country, doctors, nurses, lawyers. And then also they're engines of economic growth, like Hong Kong is, Bombay is. And thirdly, they're places of hope for the have-nots. So for these three things, I think they're going to change India. They're wonderful, yeah.
And when you design for everybody. Yet there is this rich divide in any city of rich and poor.
Oh, yes.
How do you address that in, say, your housing projects?
Well, there are two kinds. One is where you use brick and stuff, and that you may call it low cost, but it's still middle class housing. There's a whole, India's like a big iceberg, a pyramid, and about 60% are squatters right now in Bombay, and the lower half of those people couldn't afford brick. And so it's more a question of open to sky space. You know, like if I have a room and I have a courtyard or a terrace, I have two rooms. So how do you get patterns in which people can use open space and colonize it, which is the traditional way a village grows up.
I love your housing designs, whether they be the low-rise or your high-rise, because they're sustainable.
Yeah.
And what do you think about those people that are building next door to you that are like the glass skyscraper, which are totally unsustainable?
Well, I prefer not to think of them, but it seems to me that it used to be that the building was shaped. It used to be, meaning I'm talking about thousands of years of history. Igloos look like igloos and something else looks like something else because of the way climate works on human beings. And the architect's imagination was to try and deal with that through the shape of the building. Mm-hmm. Right now I just make a dumb building of glass, and then by choosing low E glass, I get some LEEDs certification. It's because the mechanical engineer steps in and solves all my problems. And that's been going on for at least 30 or 40 years. And that's very bad because he denies me my imagination. If there weren't mechanical engineers, I'm not blaming them, it's our fault. Yeah, we would have to use our own ingenuity to see that the hot air and the cold air, whatever we wanted to do. Right.
You were speaking about the architecture and sculpture, and you very much work with artists, and you can see art throughout your buildings, like architecture as a metaphor, like the Big Bang or the Black Hole. And you've worked with many artists. Yes. And your wife Monica is also a fantastic artist. Yes. Do you ever work together?
No, we haven't actually.
Not yet.
I've never, no, other architects commissioner, but I haven't. Yes, maybe I should do that.
But you have worked very much with
many
great architects.
Yes, very much, and I learned a lot through Monica's weaving and stuff. I learned, weaving is a lot like architecture. It's structured. Yes, and I worked with many artists. There were people like Howard Hodgkin, who did the British Council. And when I say work with them, I mean I don't just say this is your space. We try and use the painting to correct the architecture, or use the architecture to modify the painting. So the British Council, the whole facade steps back, so his shadow of a tree becomes extremely complex.
It's beautiful building, and the three spaces, and wherever you view them from, you can see the art and architecture as a whole.
And I've also worked with, at the other extreme, with traditional artists, like in JKK.
Yes.
Those are all Rajasthani artists doing absolutely conventional, beautiful images which exist in their minds and in history, and they recreate them. And then in between, I worked with the people who do these cinema posters in a hotel in Goa, because they can do things very fast, and it's wonderful the way it modifies the space.
One thing I have to ask you about is Jane Drew, who you've come across many. Tell me the Jane Drew story.
Oh, well, there's no story. I mean, Jane Drew was one of the architects of Chandigarh, and one of the first things, one of the things I entered was a competition for low-cost housing, and it specified some apartments, And I hated the idea, so I just developed this tube house, which is very narrow, and it works, the whole thing works like a machine for living. The hot air gets out, etc. You got some louvers. And we sent it off. And she was on the jury, and she liked it, and she just, it must have what's it called? Rolled over everyone else. And gave it the first prize and came to Bombay, and I didn't know her, and she went to a friend's office and she said, Pilu, do you know Charles Correa? Call him over.
Yeah.
And then that's why I knew I'd won. But it was very nice that she stuck her neck out, because at that time it was quite an outlandish thing to do. Anyway.
That's fantastic. She's a great hero of ours.
She's
wonderful. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And finally, I wanted to ask you one question on the future students. What advice would you give to the students of the future?
I would think the thing about architecture is that you can't teach it. You can learn it, but you can't teach it. And a good school is a school which makes you passionate about architecture and tells you and teaches you how to ask questions. Because the school doesn't know where you will work, what your clients will be, etc. But if you might be working in the Gulf, you might be working back in London, you might be working in India, China. But if you know how to ask the right questions, you will develop your own philosophy and your own visual vocabulary. That's the best advice I can give. And I know that I learned principles. I studied at Michigan, at MIT. Luckily, and of course I learned the tricks of the trade, but luckily it never impressed me. And what was nice was the principles. When I went back to India, I had no problem actually, frankly, adjusting whatsoever. Everyone asked me that.
Yeah.
But I've never designed a glass building. I never felt the need to. Of course I've used glass, but I wouldn't say I've ever designed a glass star. I would be so stupid as to do that.
Well, isn't it fantastic that you did stick to those principles, and you've got your life's work here, over 150 projects, and it's now in the heart of the RIBA.
Okay,
and you've added to us at the RIBA to be the leading cultural centre. So thank you so much for that gift.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the exhibition you put up. I mean that.
That's great.
It's beautiful. Thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. Anytime here at the RIBA.
Thank you.
Thanks.
This is NDTV, and you're watching Classics.
Hello and welcome to the Unstoppable Indians. Every week we take a journey into the life of an outstanding Indian, a person whose talent, acumen or moral example is transforming India. The best, the finest from every field join me, Manvi Dhillon, on this show to share their life story, their journey to success. The knocks along the way, what made them get up and keep going, what makes them an unstoppable Indian. My guest today is an architect, a planner, an activist, a theoretician in a career that spans the design of great buildings, great cities, right up to effective, affordable housing. His achievements, very few can match. He's a major figure in contemporary architecture, not just in India, but around the world. Charles Correa, thank you very much for joining us on the Unstoppable Indians. You know, I'm going to start here in Goa. We're sitting in a home that you have designed, and this place is special to you.
Well, yes, my family's from Goa, but I like this place actually because it's a location on the Mandovi River. That's a beautiful river. I mean, there are two rivers in Goa, and the Zuari is the other one, but this is the historic river. And so I always wanted to have a site on the water, and then luckily there was someone who came along, had the site, and they wanted 30 houses. So we took the two end ones, and I designed them in such a way that everyone has a garden, and then we have a common garden, what's called a back garden, which you can only reach through the houses. And that's beautiful because you can walk up and down along this kind of semi-public, semi-private, a community space, which is very good. And it makes for a community, yeah.
Is there something about this architecture that is almost sort of characteristic of Charles Correa's work?
Well, let me say what I did with it. We just, we used the natural levels of the site, exaggerated them a little bit so that you came down to this point where so as you enter, you're really stepping down to this water. And that's the most compelling thing you can do. Look through a house and see the water ahead of you. then you don't have to play any tricks. I mean, we just use a tiled roof, simple brick walls and columns. And in fact, if we had played tricks and made an over-ambitious house, it would have killed the site. You had to be very quiet to hear what the site had to say. And that's very important in architecture, to listen to the site, yes.
And I'm going to talk about that, the importance of listening to what the site has to say. But I want to talk about a project that you took on when you were 28 years old, the Gandhi Memorial in Sabarmati. And, you know, people say it's one of the most compelling national monuments in contemporary India and around the world, actually. Do you think it was a child prodigy at work, or it was a moment of genius, or it just all came together?
No, it's the same thing. It's just that that was a place where you knew you had to speak. I mean, Gandhiji was not the same as, say, Washington or Nehru. I mean, the Washington Memorial in Washington is a perfect piece of hardware for George Washington. Gandhiji wasn't that kind of person. He was a much more modest man. And we had to do something on a human scale. I knew that. And I knew I would like to use the local materials, the brick and the ladi, the kota stone, etc., but which he had used in his own house. But I knew we had to speak with our voice, with our contemporary voices. I don't believe that architecture is kitsch. You don't go back and copy something and then bring it into the 21st century. No, you have to reinvent it in a vocabulary and a syntax which speaks of your time. And that's all we did, actually. It's a very simple thing. Because we kept that human scale, because we kept a kind of meandering pattern. The units joined together in a very casual, with the way the houses in a village. It wasn't consciously done. It just was the mood you wanted. And what I did, which I've done in all the other museums I've designed since then, like the Crafts Museum in Delhi, is have between units which show you something about Gandhiji, have open spaces, partly covered sometimes, where you can think about what you've seen. And that I learned in school, I think, at MIT. One of my professors, who was a painter, Kepish, he said, there's such a thing as museum fatigue. You go to the Louvre and you go through room after room after room. There has to be a point at which you stop and you think about what you saw. The eye can rest and the mind can contemplate. And that's perfect for Gandhiji because it's really a place of scholarship, and we had to establish that mood. So you see, it all comes together. You're working from different directions. You know you want a place of contemplation. You know you want to do, and suddenly, it's rather like a jigsaw puzzle. You suddenly say, gosh, this fit. I know I'm looking for a piece which says this and that, and that's the possibly.
And then the
piece.
rest of it just falls.
Yeah, and then
place.
once you make the right decision there, then the rest just designs itself. If you start with the wrong idea, then you really have to catch your ear from the side. You have to do all sorts of tricks, but not if you get it right in your first step.
This is such a trite question, but of all the great buildings that you've designed, and you know, the Bhopal State Assembly, the Jawahar Kala Kendra in Jaipur as well, the Gandhi Ashram, there's so many, I could list them all, but is there one that gives you a complete sense of satisfaction? This is Charles Correa.
Well, I mean, there are 3 or 4. They all I mean, they look at different issues. I think Kanchanjunga Apartments in Bombay, I like very much. It's a high-rise building, but it's also a piece of sculpture. And I think architecture is sculpture, but with the gestures of human habitation. It's not abstract, and yet it is. But it has to show how human beings are scale. I think another good building is the Gandhi Ashram. There's a building in Jaipur, which is it's an art center named after Nehru. It's a beautiful thing. It's based on the mandala, and I'm very proud of that building, though it's not really looked after. That's the sad thing in India, I think, is that we build buildings, and there are lots of other architects too, but you know, we don't look after the buildings we build. I mean, it's not just my silly work. It's not even just Corbusier. It's even the Taj Mahal.
You know, I'm going to ask you almost a philosophical question here. If you were to say, this is the philosophy behind Charles Correa's architecture, and this I want in your words, what is really that philosophy? We've got a glimpse into it based on our conversation so far, but what is that philosophy?
I would think that, I would say that, I've never thought about it, but that's a nice direct question. I'll have to find an answer. I think that I would say architecture is rooted in the place on which it stands. It's quite unlike music. A great pianist like Rubinstein or Ravi Shankar can take his sitar to New York or to anywhere, or to Tokyo, and play the same Rubinstein would play the same Chopin concert, because music is a movable feast, not architecture. You cannot do the same building in Goa that you would do in, let's say, in Delhi. Why is that? It's because architecture has to deal with the local climate, unlike music. It has to deal with the materials. It has to deal with the culture of that place, with the lifestyle, and with the aspirations. Architecture isn't just about looking backward. I think that's overdone today. Architects deal with the future. They deal with the aspirations of their clients. It's foolish to drag people back. It's because, I'm not saying that heritage is foolish, but it's silly to overemphasize that and not create something from our generation which will become the next generation's heritage, etc. We must speak with our own voices and respect the earlier voices, but speak with your own voice.
Is there a source of inspiration or multiple sources of inspiration that you draw upon when you're embarking on a new project, or is it the site that speaks to you?
No, the site, and of course the program. I mean, you think that if someone says, I want this house, and you'd say, well, you know, they've got 3 children and a dog, and they love music, and then you'd say, if I had 3 children and a dog, and I love music, this is the kind of, and I had this site, this is how I would like to live. But taking into account as much as you can of what you understand about them. I mean, that's a very important determinant, because architecture finally is a thing you must use. So it's not just an abstraction. That's what's wrong in much of the work we see today. It just becomes overly abstract. No, it's an abstraction which is rooted in that place, rooted in that society. Now, if the client suddenly says, no, I want an extra bedroom, then of course you could compromise and just attach it. That would be wrong. I would never do that. I would go back and start from square one. You'd say, oh gosh, now I want 4 bedrooms and only 2 dogs, so this is what I would think I would do. And so you are really, in a sense, listening to the client, but you also are, in another sense, listening to your own inner voice. You are, in a way, your own client, your own agenda.
I'm going to steer you towards the less controlled sort of projects that you've taken on in your life, and that's city planning and the role of planning for our big, congested cities. In the 60s itself, you, along with 2 colleagues, were involved with the plan for New Bombay, and you live in that city, you know that city. When you look at it today, what do you feel? Is it?
It's very exciting and getting to be more and more crowded. As it gets more crowded, actually the intensity of the interaction goes higher and the decibel level, so to speak, which makes it a better city, but worse as a physical place to live. No, but when I think back, I'm glad you thought of that. I'd forgotten about it. In 1964, I think, 3 of us, just private citizens, all young, about 30, 35 years old, we put out this idea. We said that, look, this first squatters had begun to appear in the early 60s. And it was clear that they were growing faster than the Pakka housing. And we said it's because there's no match, there's a mismatch between demand and supply. There are more people wanting housing, wanting jobs than the supply. Now, therefore, you have to restructure the city. You have to find new places, because as long as you have public transport, people can get to a job. And so that whole idea of New Bombay was to restructure Bombay using that bridge which had come up and the NOSL, the chemical industry there, to open up the line to the hinterland of the state. Now, it's amazing that that idea went through. That after, but it took 6 years, maybe that's when I started to write and arguing on committees and stuff, and the Maharashtra government did that. So I do think that big ideas too can get through, but then they didn't follow it up the way it should have.
And it should be a continuous process when you're talking about a city like Bombay.
Yeah, it should be continuous at Bombay, and it should be based on public transport. You see, the success of Bombay, and this we must understand, it's probably one of the few large cities in the world whose very structure was generated by railway lines.
I'm changing so many tracks here, but you've worked overseas as well so much, and the affordable housing in Peru is, of course, one of those projects that mid-career comes to mind. What's it like working in a in another country? I mean, you know, we've talked about how architecture is culturally rooted. So when an Indian goes to Peru or to the United States, how does he build those roots and then go about designing?
Well, first of all, I haven't built in so many countries. I've built about 3 or 4 projects abroad. The one in Peru I could relate to because it was about low-cost housing. And Peru is also a developing country. It has a climate very much like we do on the West Coast. And it was quite easy to do that. I wouldn't be able to do housing, let's say, in some other country, well, in Canada, let's say, easily. The other ones I've done, I've always built in a place which spoke to me, which I knew something about, like Boston. I mean, I studied at MIT, so I know that place and I know what you can do and what you can't do. And New York, of course, I've never lived there, but I've visited it. And now I'm doing a building in Toronto for the Aga Khan, and it's much tougher because I don't know Toronto. I mean, know it in this sense. When we built our house in Bangalore some years ago, I wanted to put the veranda on front. Then I realized I'd never seen someone in Bangalore sitting on their veranda because it's so clammy and cold. People don't do it, whereas in Goa you hardly ever see a balcony without seeing 2 people sitting there looking at the traffic going by. You have to have that real experience of the place to work as you're drawing, to realize, no, that's wrong, my hand's taking me to a wrong place. And I think that is very sad because today architects are building wherever they get a commission, and we destroy our own talent because unless you listen to that inner voice, you're going to design off the top of your head. What does that mean? I mean, no poet would write a poem off the top of his head, or no painter, so why? We mustn't do that. You know, I'm very proud this is not a museum of modern art. On the contrary, it's a place of cutting-edge science and medicine where people come with real problems, suffering from cancer, from brain disease, from going blind. And we've tried to help them by using the architecture itself as therapy. The sea is therapy, the sky, nature itself. Beauty as therapy, really.
beginnings lie in the will of a man who was a great entrepreneur, actually a genius in his job. António Champalimau, his name, had created a foundation which was dedicated to human health. He was a man who looked for results. He certainly wanted his money, his wealth, in areas where we would make a difference in preventing and treating disease. And so we came to this idea, what is called translational science. So knowledge which is used to have results, which in our case would be about preventing and treating disease.
Join me in congratulating Dr. Williams for his innovative application of adaptive optics and Drs. Fujimoto, Puliafito, Swanson, Wang, and Schumann for the development of OCT on their richly deserved receipt of this year's Champalimau Vision Prize.
We did a deep study about what could make sense in the 21st century to do regarding put together research and clinic, and to do something that would be person-oriented, people-oriented, not just a basic science or just clinical, but something that could, in the whole, make some sense and be oriented to people. And in that area, we did two main choices, cancer and neuroscience.
The cancer program aims at doing clinical research and applied research in order to achieve innovations and better results in the treatment of cancer as a whole, aiming at the control of the disease and ultimately the cure of cancer. In order to do research, you must have not only doctors with their mindsets prepared to do research, but also you must interact continuously with investigators of more basic and fundamental sciences. That goes from biology to biochemistry to physics to mathematics to bioinformatics to biostatistics and so on, and then to translate those knowledges into the bed of the patient, into the patient again, and that's what we call, or is called generally, translational research.
Cancer patients can now benefit from very advanced and effective means of treatment, both in the field of chemotherapy and radiation therapy. And radiation therapy is one of those fields that has advanced the most, utilizing cutting-edge technology. We have been able, over the past few years, to implement this technology in such a way that we can spare the critical organs, the organs that would normally suffer from the treatment, in a way that the treatments can result in excellent cure rates with minimal complications.
In the neuroscience part of the research, we want to understand how the brain works, and especially how it produces behavior, how it does all these marvelous things that allow us to be ourselves. How is it that it can help us perform a simple action like reaching for a glass of water, how it enables us to talk and say meaningful things or sometimes not so meaningful. So we want to understand how is this all happening in the brain, how it emerges in the brain, and what are the specific circuits inside the brain or the molecules that generate all the behavior that we have and we see in the animal world.
We don't know where the land will be found. We are going beyond the horizon. We're trying to go beyond the horizon, and it would be foolish for us to all send our missions in exactly the same place when we don't know where we'll find a true discovery.
The interaction between basic science and clinic is one of the most challenging aspects in modern science. Typically, in many places, people are in separate buildings or institutes. This building that we are in was designed to facilitate that interaction. The way that things are designed around here leads not only to formal interaction, but to informal, casual interaction. And I think that's a very important first aspect. The space here includes a lot of open shared areas and some enclosed places that are also shared. This per se promotes interaction between people. The challenge is that, of course, if you have interaction all the time, you cannot have peace of mind to work. So there are also some more secluded places, and the functional organization of the place is still evolving, still dynamic, because we're occupying it. So the structure where we are helps interaction. That's the first point. The building per se is very beautiful, and it is a statement. So typically buildings for science are traditionally, they are not especially beautiful or especially inviting. To have a building like this in a country like Portugal, a small country with difficulties in investment in science, is a statement. It's something that doesn't go unnoticed. So when I come here and sometimes I'm discouraged and I see there is a statement, a solid statement, that even if I feel like, oh, I can't work very well this week, or these such and such things are not working so well, so you feel discouraged, there's a statement saying this is something to stay.
This really is a historic river. When you think of the great navigators who came down this river, and this act of courage it took when you reach the ocean to turn left and go down towards the coast of Africa. They probably got the maps from the Moors, for instance. I mean, the Moors must have had the Muslims had this idea of that whole part of the world, but no European had ever gone that way. And so it was a journey into the unknown. And as a wonderful metaphor for what science does, I mean, it is a journey into the unknown. So when I saw the site, I knew we must actually make that connection. But another thing happened when I first saw the site. It was evening. I had just come in from Bombay and I was on my way somewhere else. It was raining. The gate was locked. So we had to walk along the curve out there. And I said, I want to see where the river joins the ocean. And Jean said, it's just a little further, and we never found it because rain was coming down. We had no overcoats. But I think that was very important, because since I didn't experience the site except along the curve, I was very aware of the curve of the site. When I went to sleep that night in the hotel, I knew we must make a project that when you enter it, you are aware that there's an ocean out there, that there's this world which you have of the unknown, and you have to have the courage to go and see it. So it really is celebrating the history of Portugal. I would think the defining moment, you could arguably, the defining moment of their history. And yet it is done in the context of new work to be done.
In this building, people that came here, people in Lisbon that came here, they can see the importance of science, the importance of the treatment, and the people that are here doing science or treating people can see the importance of the people and that the work is to that people. And this combination between the city and the people and the researchers and the clinicians that are here are very, very, very important. And this is one of the most important issues, is put everything together, even the building. This is a part of the project. It's not neutral, it's a part of this project.
If I can explain you a little bit about the experience of living and working in this building, I would tell you a curious impression that is my own. Because the first time I arrived here, I was in fact overwhelmed with the beauty of the building. But I thought to myself, how can we work in here in terms of a clinical activity that we usually do in a much more conventional, let's say, building. And the first ideas in order to organize the functional areas of the clinic, we thought we must change a lot of things. And then, as the time was passing, we became realizing that that was not the case. Because in fact, we don't need to change anything. We just need to adapt to the building. And particularly in oncology, as you know, one of the main areas of treatment is the administration of chemotherapy, which is sometimes a very long, tedious and painful, let's say, sometimes, procedure. And for that we have a place that doesn't look like a hospital. You sit in a chair that you feel like you are at home, you can see your TV program or work in your computer, have your friend besides you. So it's again something that can be done without creating what is conventional hospital atmosphere. And that's a big success, I can say. And we are increasingly recognizing a very well thought building in order to achieve precisely what we are doing.
It's a marvelous building. Working in the building and coming to understand the architecture is something that takes a long time. There are many elements to the building that you only begin to appreciate after you have been living in them for some time. So we've been here now 2 years, a bit more than 2 years, and I still feel very much as if I'm discovering things about the place. And this is the same case for working in any other great building like the Salk. But this place makes an immediate impression. I mean, especially from the outside or in the spaces near here where the window opens onto the sea. It's a dramatic building, no doubt.
And this building has sort of the shape of a ship departing, and has the big windows of a ship. Now, in modern world, we know a lot about the geography of the Earth, but there are a lot of unknowns. So I imagine this ship departing to understand what our brain is and how to improve treatment for cancer. And so this is another, it's a metaphor, but you work inside the metaphor.
Of course, architecture is sculpture, but it's sculpture for use, for human use. And so it has the openings for light, air, doors, windows, and it's very important that those openings don't spoil the sculpture, but they make it more perfect, more beautiful. It has the gestures of human occupation. That is what architecture is about. You know, this really is a kind of non-building, because the walls you're looking at, these big curved walls, they really could be landscape. They're really creating this pathway to the Atlantic Ocean, which is the whole point of the site. And the nice thing about these walls is that they also divide the site into the public areas, which is given back to the city of Lisbon, to the citizens, to come and enjoy this place, and then the semi-private areas, which is where the science and the medicine takes place. And they coexist in a kind of thing which the Chinese call yin-yang, which is wonderful. Both yin and yang, one is positive, one is negative, are equally important. So the public space here is 50% of the site given back to the city by the foundation, but it still keeps enough for this work, research work, to go on. And these walls with their big cutouts, etc., allow enough privacy for the public. They don't feel that they're disturbing patients. And for the patients, they have enough privacy that they don't feel they have people looking at them. And this all comes from really very old principles. And of course, at the end of this walkway is where you reach the river and then the ocean. But first you see this body of water, where you have this enigmatic object in it. It could be an island, it could be a jellyfish, a Portuguese man of war. It's what you go in search of. It's what drives you to discover. So that is the analogy which ties the great navigators to today's scientists, both here in Portugal, both on the same site.
this building is extremely beautiful. This center is extremely beautiful. It sits in a very special place in Lisbon, in a historical part of Lisbon, and it pays tribute to the meaning of this area of the city. And there's only an architect who is a genius, could design, could understand, and could make happen. And so I said, we are extremely privileged to have him and have him as our architect.
A building cannot move, and that is both its handicap but its great strength, because a building is rooted in its place, in the climate, in the soil, in the materials, in the culture, and in the aspirations. And I think that's what a building has to express. So history is part of it, aspirations equally, and what we are talking about in this river is aspirations which made history.